In my last video, I introduced Next.js intercepting routes and modals, and there was an overwhelming response asking me to create another video where I show how to use a modal with a form. So let's get started. Hello and welcome, I'm Dave. Today we'll look at how to handle forms in a Next.js modal window, and I'll provide links to all resources in the description below. Hey everybody, welcome, I'm Dave, and before we get started, I just want to say thank you to everyone for all the supportive comments and stories you left in the comments. On my last video, I asked for your story, and I'm doing that once again. So if you haven't left your story in the comments to say how I've maybe helped you get started in web development or help you continue on your career in web development, I really appreciate it when you do leave those comments. It keeps me motivated, so thanks. And speaking of sharing your story, let's talk about today's sponsor, Daily.dev. Daily.dev is a completely free tool that over 500,000 developers use every day to stay up to date and at the top of their game. This is because Daily.dev lets you build a personalized topic feed from curated text sources. And I'm happy to say my blog is one of those text sources. The Daily.dev platform is available as a browser extension or a mobile app. And don't miss out on joining a squad to network and discuss topics with other devs that are using the same tech stack as you. Daily.dev content always has a TLDR at the top to give you the bottom line fast. And if you want to read more but don't have time, you can bookmark any content at Daily.dev to read later. Every developer should utilize this free resource and be part of the Daily.dev community. Today we're going to take the advanced Next.js routing pattern of using a parallel route with an intercepting route and creating a modal, and then we're going to put a form in that modal. Now there are several considerations when you combine a modal window with a form, and I'm going to share several of those, including why I think React hook form is still the best approach to using forms like this in Next.js. But we're also going to apply a server action and have validation throughout. Now before we get started, I want to mention a couple of prerequisite videos. I'm not going to rehash how parallel routes work in Next.js or how intercepting routes work, but I've created videos in the last couple of weeks on those. So as a prerequisite for this video, I recommend watching my parallel routes video first, and then my intercepting route video where we create a modal, and then you'll be up to speed for this tutorial. And with that said, let's get to it. Okay, I'm in VS Code and I've already started a Next.js project. I've got the package JSON open. I just want to go over the dependencies as well as which version of Next.js we're using. Currently, I installed the latest, which is 14.2.3. Now, Next.js has released a Next.js 15 release candidate, but that doesn't mean it's stable yet or out there for full consumption in production. So we're still using just what you install with the latest. Now that may change any day, but right now it's 14.2.3. The other dependencies, and I'm not going to walk you through installing all of these. You should know at this point that it's npm I for install and then whatever the dependency is. So what I'm also using is zod for validation and also a small library for fetching data because I'm not connecting to a database. I'm just fetching some API data in this tutorial. So I'm using zod-fetch as well. And then we also have the @hook form resolvers, and that gives us a zod resolver that we use with React hook form. So all four of those dependencies that I just mentioned, the rest of these dependencies get installed either with Tailwind or as you install ShadCN components. Now we are going to use several ShadCN components today, and I went over that in a previous tutorial as well, even in the last one about the intercepting route and a modal, but I do have a dedicated video to using the ShadCN UI library, so you might also want to check that out, and I'll link to it in the video description as well. Now you won't see all the components you install from ShadCN in the package JSON. That's not how it works. You see some of the Radix dependencies here, and you even see Lucid React here, but you don't see everything. So the way you do see that is to go ahead and open the source directory if you're using that with your Next.js project. Go to the components directory, you'll see over here on the left-hand part of the screen, and then in the UI directory that ShadCN creates, you see all the components you've added. And if you've worked with ShadCN before, you know you install these components one at a time. And I've got an alert dialog. I've also got a button, the regular dialog that we used for the modal in the last video as well, a form component, an input component, a label component, and also a table component. So we'll be using all of those today. I really recommend just downloading my completed code, and you can review this with me, and of course then you could go back over it if you want to. But if you're going from scratch, you need to install each one of these. Then after that, you'll want to look at my completed code even if you're not using it, because I've got 3 custom components I created over here. Now one is the modal component that was in the last video as well, but I've added a few things to it, so we'll go over that. I've got an input with label component, so I've made my own custom input component there. And then I have an alert confirmation component, and we'll go over how that works as well. Now, besides all of these dependencies I just mentioned, we're also using JSON server and just serving some data that we can fetch. So I have a users.json file that you'll find in a data folder in my source code. And here you can see I've just got 10 users and some JSON data, and it's simplified from what you would find at the JSON placeholder website, where we just have an ID, first name, last name, and email. And we're going to be pulling up these users out of a table and then being able to edit each one in the modal. So we want to start up our JSON server first before the project, because it will be looking for that data. So control and the backtick to open a terminal window. And after that gets started, we want to type npx JSON-server. Then I'm going to type -w, that's the watch flag, and we're going to tell it to watch the data directory, and then inside of there users.json. Then I also want -p for port. We're going to use port 3500 because our Next.js development project will run on port 3000, and JSON server would default to port 3000 if we don't tell it otherwise. We can't have them both on the same port. So port 3500, press enter. It should find that user's JSON file, and it gives us the endpoint here, localhost 3500/users. And with the data server now started, I'm going to open a second terminal window by clicking the plus here. And now inside of this one, I just want to start the project so we can check it out, see how it works before we look at all of the code in VS Code. So type npm run dev. This should start our Next.js project on port 3000 here on localhost. So I'll click Control key and then click the link. Just open that up in Chrome, and here we go. So the main page, I just have a view users link because we want to go to the users feed or the users route segment. So I click that. This will fetch the data from that JSON file that's running on our JSON server. And now we have 10 users here in a table. So at any one of these that we can click on. So when we click on one of these rows in the table, and I'll just click on the one with my name, it'll launch that in a modal, which might take just a second, but there we go. And after that, we can edit this. So here's first name, last name, email. Now, we could clear this out. And remember, this is using my input with label custom component that I built around ShadCN components. But you can just clear it out like that. You can type a new name, and it has zod validation built in with React Hook Forms. So if I just type one letter and leave, then I get the validation here, must be 2 or more characters long, and I only had 1 character. So as soon as I change that, the full name John, and tab out, that validation goes away. Now that is one reason I like React Hook Form over just using server actions with a form, because with a server action, when you submit to a form, or use the form to submit to a server action, I should say, what happens is you don't get that instant feedback on blur, which would be when you leave the input here. You have to actually submit the form and then get the feedback. Now, I'm going to show you how to do that because it's good to apply that validation on the server as well. But really, Zod applies it here all in the client. So I think it does a great job of giving that immediate feedback. Now, what else could happen? So we have changed this, we haven't saved it yet, so maybe we click away, and now, instead of just closing the modal and losing our changes, should say we get this alert confirmation. So this is another one of those components I made, one of the custom components, and it works with the alert dialog that is available in ShadCN. So this says, hey, you haven't saved your changes yet. I'm going to show you how to implement that. We could continue and exit anyway, or we could cancel. I'll continue for now. Let's open this back up. Another big issue that had been in Next.js right up until April of this year with the release of 14.2 was we weren't able to call router refresh from a modal without creating an error. And the same thing on the server. Say on a server action, you couldn't call revalidate path, for example. When you had a modal open, you would get an error. but now you can. And that's a big deal because now, say I'll change this to John once again. I'll go ahead and save the changes. It says user updated, so that's the response from the server action. But now, when I close this, we go back, you can see this table is already updated with John here as well. So we see the changes propagate immediately everywhere. And for example, now I don't have this, but say you had a field that could not be edited. So you have a field showing data, but it's disabled. This would be something common in a business application to show maybe when this data was last updated. So if you did that same thing and you saved, and then you call router refresh, then it's going to refresh this client-side cache of data, and you would also get that new data in the disabled field instead of still seeing the old timestamp, for example. So that's important as well. Now, I showed you the client-side validation with React Hook Form and Zod already. So if we try to submit here, for example, we get that validation. But what I didn't show you was the server action validation. I'll show you that when we get to it in the code review. But the other thing that I do want to show here is this still applies the fallback route segment. And we went over this in the last tutorial about intercepted routes on modals. So we have a modal right now, but if we refresh the page, we're going to get this without a modal. So it's the fallback route segment. This is the route segment that was intercepted, but instead we displayed it in a modal. So a refresh doesn't lose that. It would lose any changes, but at least you still get the page. And if you go back, you still go back to your table of results. So now let's go to VS Code and see how all of this is set up. Hey, I hope you're enjoying the video. You may be surprised to learn that 3 out of every 4 viewers, nearly 75% of everyone that watches a video on my channel, is not subscribed. So I just wanted to take a quick second and remind you to hit that subscribe button if you haven't. It really helps out. Now back to the video. Okay, I'm back in VS Code, and I'm going to assume at this point that you are looking at my completed code. I think it's really going to help you get through this, and I won't spend as much time on each one as I would if you were typing everything out, and the same for me. So if we're here inside of the page, this is the root page inside the app directory, and it just has the link to the user segment. Now, when we look at the user segment, this is where we applied both the regular route segment, that is the edit, or we have the modal, and the modal is the parallel route that contains the intercepting route. So first, let's just look inside of users here at the page, and this is where we get all of the users and display them in a table. So now here we're fetching this data. You can see get users, and we'll look at that in a moment as well. And then inside of this table, we just map over it, and I have a separate user row component that is also co-located right here. And you can see it as just the table row as well as a handle click, and that uses router.push from the use router hook. That's what sends us to that edit route that we just talked about right up here. So that's pretty much it. A basic table has the user data and each row has one user. Now, if we look at the layout, since we're using a modal, as I'd covered in the previous tutorials on parallel routes and intercepting routes, this is actually a parallel route called modal. You can see the type here, and it's also rendered inside of the user's layout. So now when we look at the traditional route, not the modal, not the intercepted route, you can see it receives an ID param, and then it goes to a page here, and inside of there is the user form component. So I co-located that component as well. Now, for this route segment, we receive that ID, then we use a get user, not get users, but just one user, get user. And then we say if we don't find a user, we say no users found for that ID, but if we do, we pass that user into the user form so we can edit that user. And that's simply all there is to that. However, if we go to the modal parallel route that contains the intercepted route, now, if you remember from the previous intercepted modal tutorial, we're using parentheses with 1 dot because these are considered on the same level, even though it's inside that modal directory. That's because the modal directory isn't really there as far as the directory path is concerned. This just indicates a parallel route. So we use 1 dot because they're considered on the same level. Then inside of this, it essentially mirrors what we had down here. Now, also from the previous tutorial, you'll remember how important that default file is for an intercepting route. You just have to have it to make it work. It doesn't do anything. We're returning null when we use a modal. But then inside of the page, the only difference we'll see is that I'm also importing the modal. Now the user form is imported and I didn't have to recreate that, so it's imported from the previous route segment, so you'll see the path for the import is a little longer here, but it's the same user form component. Now down here we have this edit user, and you can see we get the ID param, we get the user just like before. The only difference here is we're wrapping anything we return in the modal component. And so that's the important part to note. And that kind of gets us up to speed from the last tutorial. We've already created a modal. We have the intercepting route, so we don't have to go over how everything works with those. But now we're ready to launch our modal that contains the user form component. Now quickly, before we look at the user form component, I mentioned these data fetching functions. So we have getUser and getUsers. Let's quickly look at those. If I'll scroll down here to the lib directory, you can see I've got both of them. Let's look at the getUsers function. They're both a lot alike. So what I'm using that I really want to highlight is this simple package called zod-fetch. So it changes our fetch just a little bit. Instead of using just the traditional fetch, this package lets us first pass in a zod schema. So here you can see I'm using a zod array and I'm passing in the user schema, which is a zod schema that I created inside of this schemas directory over here. I can quickly click on that. You can see the user schema for one user. And then I'm also exporting the type user that is inferred from this user schema. So that's a very handy file for using Zod. If you haven't, I've got a video on that as well. And I've even got a YouTube short on using that zod-fetch that we saw over here. But I'm creating that, calling it fetch users. I'm passing in the schema. Then I've got the URL where we fetch, and then I've got options. So it's a lot like using a regular fetch, except the first param is that zod schema. So this is getting users, plural, because it's a zod array. And the only difference here, the get user is just getting one user. So I just have the user schema, no array. And I just noticed here at the top, I had imported zod, and I really didn't need to because I was using that z.array in the get users, but I don't even need that in the singular get user. I just need the create zod fetcher here and the user schema. So now we're ready to look at that user form component and how it works with React Hook Forms. So I'm going to come back and find that it was in the edit path. And then here's the page, and co-located is the user form. Let's start at the top with all of the dependencies. Now this is a client component. Previously we were working with server components. Even that table was a server component, but the table row was a client component because we needed to click on that to launch the modal. Now we have useForm imported from React Hook Form. Then we have a form component, a button component, my custom input with label component. All of those are built around ShadCN, and this form and button are both directly from ShadCN. We have the Zod resolver to use with React Hook Form. Then I import in my user schema from Zod, and I've also got the type user. Then we have a save user server action, and then some hooks, use state, use effect, and use router come from Next Navigation. Of course, use state and use effect come from React. So let's see how all of this works in the form. So we've got our type, our users being passed in. Then we define a message and an errors state. These are things we're going to get back from the server action that we expect to get. So we just define both of those here. Then of course we just set up the router from Next.js. This is where we initiate our form with React Hook Form. So we define our form, we use the useForm hook. It receives the user type. So we want the mode to change when we get that validation was on blur. That's when you saw me tab out of the field or click outside of the field. That is on blur. That gives the user that immediate validation feedback. Now our resolver is where we use the Zod resolver, and we pass in the Zod user schema that we created. And the default values, well, we just create a new object here from the user that is passed in. So the default values for the form, it will already be filled out with that user data that you saw in my example. Now as we scroll down, here's the next part, and I'm going to press Alt-Z just to wrap any code that doesn't scroll off the screen. And you can see I am using useEffect. I know some people say you don't need useEffect anymore. I think it's still very useful at times, and this is one of those times. So inside of this useEffect, I'm going to set a local storage item. I'm setting user form modified. This is going to be Boolean, and I'm using the form state here. So form.formState.isDirty, and then you have to set it to a string. And we're just saying, is it true or false, essentially. And we put in the dependency array here, form.formState.isDirty. It's a Boolean. Now, the form is considered to be dirty anytime you have changed a field. So that's important. We know the form has been edited. Now, if we were to click away, we would get that alert, essentially. I have to set that up yet. I'm going to show you how we did that. But we get that alert if the form is dirty and we haven't saved those changes. So this lets us know we need to save changes. Now, it doesn't trigger the alert. We have to set that up on our own. But this is the way we know the changes have been made. So otherwise, we could click away if we haven't made any changes and we won't get an alert. So this seems like a good time to show how that works in that alert component. So I'm going to scroll down to the components, and here we can look at the modal first, really, because that's where we check this. I'm going to Alt-Z once again to wrap that down. Now here in the modal, this is a little bit more than we had in the previous tutorial where we launched a modal with an image. This now uses state, and I have show exit confirmation and of course set show exit confirmation. Then I have a close modal function that just calls router back, but we also have that handle open change function we've had before. It just has a little bit more to it. Now we're looking in local storage when this handle open change is called. So when we close the modal, this function is called, and we're looking inside of that. Now, if we have a value for is user form modified, then we need to check that. And if you just try to call JSON parse on is user form modified, you're going to have a type error because it says, hey, it might be null or it might not exist. So you need to confirm that it exists first and then use the 2 ampersands, then JSON parse. And this will turn that string that you get out of local storage back into an actual Boolean, true or false. So if that is true, then you want to show the exit confirmation, and that launches our alert component. Otherwise, router back and we can just exit. So that would be what we would get if nothing had been changed. Now, what we had here for the close modal just closes. So let's look at how those are applied in the alert confirmation component that we import. We can give a message here, and you can see my message about saving. But we also have set open. This is where you get the set show exit confirmation. The confirmation action is the close modal, where you would just click confirm to say, yes, I want to close without saving. And that would, of course, close the modal. Otherwise, you would have this Boolean here that would say, okay, we're going to show this confirmation. Actually, we've shown the confirmation. So otherwise, if you cancel out, I should say, then you're still going to be in the modal. And we can pull that back up to see how it works one more time. Back here in the browser, if I click on one of these users, we get the modal here. So now let's say I make a change. I'll just delete everything out of there. And I click away. Now we get that confirmation. If I want to continue, I want to confirm that I want to exit without saving, I'll just click continue. And then I've exited. But if I come back here and make another change, click like I'm going to leave, and I click cancel, I'm still in the modal. And so that's what that logic does. Now feel free to use my custom alert confirmation component because it's not very much different from what is available at ShadCN when you look at how to apply everything that ShadCN gives you with the alert dialog. So you can use this code that is in my repository as well. Now let's go back to the user form and look at the rest of that. So I need to find it. Here it is inside of the edit route config. And now as we scroll down after checking to see if the form is dirty or not, if we want to confirm and leave or not, now we have an async onSubmit function. And this is what is called when the form is submitted. So notice we clear out any messages we might have received from the server action already. I have a note here, and this is good to note, but there's no need to validate here, as you might see in a tutorial that uses server actions only. We don't need to pull in Zod to validate everything because we're already using that Zod resolver with React Hook Form, and it's validating everything pretty much as it's entered into the form. But now we can call our server action right here, and we use form.getValues from React Hook Form, pass in all the form values to our server action. Now what we'll get back is this result, and the result might have errors. And if it does, we set the message and set errors, and then exit the function with a return. But if it doesn't, then we set a message which is a success message. Then we call router refresh. And now this is important. I highlighted this earlier. We call router refresh, and it updates the client-side cache. And that way, when we exit the modal, we already see the update in that table, and it also updates anything that we would have in our modal that maybe didn't get edited, like a timestamp or something like that. Then it's also important to call form reset and pass in the current form values after that. That's because this resets the dirty fields. Now, we won't see anything change. I'm not using a timestamp in our example, but that is dirty value that gets saved into local storage. That gets reset when we reset the form. So now's a good time to look at that server action as well. So I'll just control click here, open the server action. You can see it's got the use server directive at the top. I'm pulling in the user schema and the user type. And I've also got a return type here. And notice it's wrapped in a promise here by the function. And then we've got save user that receives the user, and it's an async function. I'm going to show you how the errors work and do this to create those errors, but first let's just break down this server action. So now we're actually parsing what we receive to validate it. So I'm defining parsed using the user schema.safeParse and passing in the user. This is all with Zod. And then if it is not successful, then I'm returning the message submission failed. Here's an important highlight. This is a Zod error. So we have parsed.error, which is a Zod error type. And then it has a flatten method that you can call. And then I'm saying .field errors. And so this is getting sent back. And you'll see how I loop through those in the modal form when we get to that point. Now underneath here, we just fetch that data. This is an update. We're editing the user, so it's a patch. Headers is the content type and application JSON. This is important when you're using JSON server for this example, so don't forget the headers type here. And then the body itself, which you stringify, and I'm passing in just the first name, last name, and email. Of course, we're not using that ID for anything other than to identify which user we're editing right here in the URL for JSON server. And then if all is successful, I'm just returning the message user updated. And of course, we see that update take place immediately because we call router refresh. So when we go back to the table, everything is as it should be. So now I'm going to scroll up and uncomment a couple of these lines here that will cause an error in the server action. So we had no problem with the validation, and we're sending that validated data from React Hook form, and then I'm just changing it here so we can get an error. So a deliberate error on my part, so we can see that validation from the server action. So now back in the browser, I'm just going to click on my name once again, and here we could submit anything because the data gets changed on the server. So I'll just submit this. Here's that validation that we get. First name must be 2 or more characters long, and then email is an invalid email address. Doesn't really apply to what we submitted. It's just an on purpose or a deliberate error, if you will, and we have that message submission failed. So let's go back and change that in the code once again, comment these out. Now if we save and we go back to the browser once again, we should be able to resubmit. And now we get user updated because everything did validate and there was no issue. So let's look at how to loop through those errors in VS Code. Back in VS Code, I'm going to go back to the user form. We scroll down, here's what we render. So at the top, everything's wrapped in a div, by the way, but then at the top, we have the message, whether it's a success message or an error message. And then we have errors right here, and I need to press Alt-Z one more time to get that to wrap. Also press Control-B to hide the file tree, so we can see this in pretty much one full line. So for errors, if they exist, then I've got this div here. And so this is a ternary, otherwise we get null. But inside of this div with red text here, you can see from Tailwind, I've got object.keys, and I'm passing in that errors object. So then we can map over that as an array for each key. Then I've got this one-line paragraph here. Now, of course, since we're mapping over it, we need to pass a key as well. But then we've got the key here, so it lists which error it is. And then we've got the errors. Now, if you've looked at my TypeScript course video that's on my channel, if you look at the index signatures chapter, that's where this comes in handy, because we've got the key, but you can't just say key or you'll still have a type error. We need to say as key of type of errors. So that lets us get through that little bit there where we don't really know what the key is going to be, but it helps us get through looping through that errors object, though, that we turned into an array. So that's pretty much how you show all of those errors at the top. Other than that, we've got our actual form down here, and you can see where onSubmit is, and then I prevent the default and then actually call the handle submit the way you need to call it for React Hook form. Then you can see my custom input with label component. Notice I'm not passing in data to each one of those right here. Instead, I'm using the use form context hook inside of this custom component that you can use with React Hook form. I'll control click, bring that down, and you can see use form context here right inside of this component. I'm not going to break down this full component. You could look at that and look at how React Hook form works. Also, ShadCN has great documentation on how to use their form with React Hook form. So I've pulled all of that together. Feel free to use this custom component as well. So that's pretty much it, and that goes over a lot of the complexities of using a form where you have validation, you have alerts telling you need to save the data because you haven't, and then you've got several other features all wrapped up into a modal, which is a very common use in a business application where you're looking at different results of, it doesn't have to be users. In my case, I work for a company with plants, so it could be plants, or it could be anything else that might be listed in a data table. And you want to keep that table open underneath, so when you close the modal, you can just pick another one instead of having to do another search for more results, and you can continue to edit each item from the table. And before I go, hey, I want to mention that I'm considering what topics to cover in the near future on my channel. I like to mix things up every now and then, and so I'm looking for new topics. Leave a comment and tell me what topics you'd like to see me cover for the rest of this year or in the near future. And I will definitely give you a like and thumbs up for that as well, because I need that feedback from you, so I appreciate it. Thanks so much for the feedback, and I'll see you next time. Hey there, giving a quick shout out to my patrons. Holy Coder is a member at the Progress Provider level, and Eldad is a member at the Senior level. Also, thank you to all of my junior members. We're building a community, and I sincerely appreciate your continued support. You're helping me reach my goals. And if you haven't checked out my Patreon, it has exclusive content and early release content. And it's not one of those Patreons that doesn't get many posts. I'm active on there every week. I'll put a link to it in the video description, so please check it out if you haven't. Remember to keep striving for progress over perfection. And a little progress every day will go a very long way. Please give this video a like if it's helped you. And thank you for watching and subscribing. You're helping my channel grow. Have a great day. And let's write more code together very soon.